Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Danny, and I'm with the learning team at Cherry Beckert. Just want to go over a few quick housekeeping items before we get started today. For audio during today's webinar, you may listen through the phone or the computer speakers. You can choose your audio under the audio tab in the menu to the right of your screen. To earn CPE for today's webinars, please make sure you answer all the polling questions. Make sure you click the submit button to submit your answer. Instructors will try to remind you of this as each poll appears. We will be distributing CPE certificates via email in the coming weeks. The instructors and I will answer questions in the question and answer pod. We will try to answer them throughout the webinar. So that's all for the announcements, and I will turn it over to Matthew.
Thank you, Danny. Appreciate it, and welcome everyone to day 2 of our not-for-profit virtual seminar. Very happy to have Bryce Gardner with us this morning. And a quick introduction to Bryce. Bryce is a principal with Cherry Beckert, and he is also the leader of our analytics and business intelligence practice. Bryce has been with us not quite a year now, and actually joined Cherry Beckert through an acquisition of a company that Bryce founded called Isimo Analytics. And that company helped with business intelligence and helping organizations become more data-driven through a combination of software tools and services that really enable for better storytelling, better visualization, and analysis of data. Bryce is very entrepreneurial in his spirit, and he brings all that skill and talent to Cherry Beckert now, where he leads the group for CB Digital. And also, Bryce, I believe you were at a not-for-profit yourself for a number of years as well. Tell us about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks, Matthew, for the introduction. I'm excited to be here. I think I spent 7 years in executive leadership at a national professional association. So our roles, responsibilities, and everything we did were about helping advance our professional members, standing in their profession. And I got the opportunity to really lead both the marketing and the technology initiatives. We blended our responsibilities in that organization to focus specifically our marketing and communications and making them be focused on digital and all things that needed to happen there. For the last 10 years, as Matthew shared, I was the founder of a company where we helped people. A lot of associations. At one point, about 60% of our clients were in the nonprofit space, and in one form or another. And ultimately, then I've also been lucky enough to get to teach at Duke's Graduate School of Business to help students and graduate students really understand the power of data visualization and analytics as you apply them to business challenges. So all exciting stuff, and some people have called me crazy because I've been involved with 6 startups. My record's currently 4-2, as Matthew mentioned, entrepreneurial. I have enjoyed the opportunity of being involved in those things, but there's also a lot of fun stress that goes along with it. But I feel like a winning record, I need to be done with the entrepreneur stuff while I'm still ahead. So now I get to bring that kind of energy to what we do in the digital practice at Cherry Beckert. So to get started, I want to start with one of your poll questions. What I would like to do is I would like all of you to answer this poll question. Do you currently have a formal data strategy? What I mean by that is, do you have a plan for what you're doing with data, how you're gathering it, how you're putting it to work in your organization? So if we can, Danny, go ahead and launch that poll. Remember to hit submit on your answers because we want to make sure everybody gets their voting done and gets their credit. All right, we're at about 95% complete, so this is good. Everybody's wanting to get credit this morning. All right, make sure you hit submit on that. So in closing the poll out, we ended up with a good mix. We have about 33% of you, so about a third, which is actually more I ask this question a lot in a lot of the webinars that I do, and it's really good to see that about 33% of you have a formal data strategy, which is really important. A lot of times that number is closer to 15 to 20%. 35% of you are no, 27% aren't sure, which would lead me to believe you probably don't have one, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And 5% of you know, but you've been pushing for one. Well, those 5% of you keep pushing. Definitely keep pushing. I'm going to step out of PowerPoint here for just a second. I'm going to share with you how I think about data and how data strategy plays into everything we do. So I'm looking at a data visualization that tells me about everybody who's attending today. Everybody who registered, everybody who's in attendance, what kind of organization they're from, what part of the country you're from. I love the person who registered in California who wanted to get up very early this morning and listen to me talk. But as I think about our data strategy and I think about this strategy that we have to use data in all aspects of what we do and in how we communicate, when I first took on this topic back in August, we didn't know what registration was going to look like. I would have come focused probably at a not-for-profit webinar, thinking specifically about how I would talk to my experience at a professional membership organization. But as you can see, we have a wide variety, a large amount from private colleges and universities. And inside those private colleges and universities, these are the type of people that are in attendance based on their title. We can also see where private colleges and universities are coming from. If I want to change this out and see health and human services organizations, I can see where all those are located and I can see the top titles. So what has data done for me in something as simple and what could be as rote as putting together a learning session? But having a data strategy that helps me drive messaging and tailor some of the conversation we're going to have today. Not all of it, obviously, because there's generic things that fit across the broad spectrum, but being able to leverage this ability to look at data, to dive deeper, to do that very quickly and get a better understanding of who the audience is, I can hopefully deliver for you something that's going to resonate. So you can not just take away the one thing that I hope you take away from today, but that you can take 2 or 3 nuggets that you can take away and put in place. So how are we going to approach this today? Well, I'm always about breaking this down. And so whenever I talk to my students at the university, or I'm talking to clients, or I'm talking to our team internally, I always think about breaking it down simply. Too many times we get caught up in the words or the hype or all the stuff that data represents today and how big of a picture it is and how quickly we can get so deep in it that it gets technically complicated when we think about analytics. I like to break it down. We have to break it down into its components, and I want to take this title and essentially break it down into components. I'm going to help share with you today what leveraging means, because too many times we just focus on the data or the analytics, but how do we leverage it? How do we put it front and center? And how do we make it the most important? The second part I'm going to break down is the analytics. And I'm going to break down, let's get on the same page with what analytics means. And then I'm going to bring some examples of the things you need to think about as you're really implementing your data strategies, as you're thinking about data strategies, and you're really putting analytics to work for you. And then in each of those cases, I'm going to give you kind of the 5 areas to be thinking about. But in those 5 areas, I'm also going to give you some very specific use cases that are in the not-for-profit space and thinking about how those things all come together. So let's get started in leveraging. The first thing we have to recognize is a lot of times we feel like we're behind. We see all the advertisements on TV about analytics and big data and IBM, and we read about what Amazon and Apple and all of those companies are doing. Well, we work with some of those companies. And in working with some of those companies, at some point, they were starting at the same place. And it would probably surprise you, some of those companies were just in that starting point not that long ago. And so as we think about that, we really have to understand that most organizations haven't fully enabled their organization with data and a data strategy, and more specifically, analytics. So we have to first get comfortable with the fact that, hey, we're not behind, but we're behind, we might be behind a little. And we can't be intimidated by the fact that we think we might be further behind than someone else. We see that with a lot of companies that come to us. They walk in the door and they say, hey, we're really behind, and I know it's you know, it's killing us. Well, that's a defeatist kind of attitude. We need to take the approach of, hey, we might be a little bit behind, but overall, organizations are still struggling to get data in the hands of everybody who needs it to be considered a knowledge worker. We need to think about it right now, because this next statement is very true. Whether you're Ford Motor Company, which is where this statement came from when I was sitting down with their chief data officer at an event we were at together, or whether you are a $250,000 top line nonprofit that's raising money for a very specific cause, the amount of data that you're going to start to see, the amount of data that's available to you, is greater than it ever has been before. And so as we think about that, we now have access to all this data because we're collecting it in so many different ways. Both internally, we can leverage external data, all of those things. Data becomes an important component, but data at rest, static data, doesn't do us any good. We have to apply analytics. We have to be thinking about what we want from our data, and then understand that as that data grows, that we have a plan to grow with it, to ask and answer more important and meaningful questions. The other thing that we have to take into account in the importance of all of this data and starting to put it to work for us has been highlighted more so than ever this year. With COVID, we've faced disruption in our organizations. Whether you're a manufacturing organization, whether you're a membership organization, whether you're a university, we have faced disruption in different ways. In August, McKinsey released this model of all the different types of disruption. And in it, in this scatter, they talked about the magnitude of that, which is on the vertical axis. What is the magnitude of these different forms of disruption? But where data comes into play and understanding our business better is in direct correlation, has direct play on the bottom axis, which is the ability to anticipate. And one of the things I find very interesting in McKinsey's study is, besides disruption taking all these different forms, one of the most impactful and one of the most predictable is a pandemic. Now everybody's like, wow, the pandemic took us by surprise and all of these things. Yes, it did. But if we think about these things and we look at history and we look at historical data, pandemics are actually kind of cyclical. We see them and we've heard about it so much more frequently, about the different cycles of pandemics and how frequently they happen and what can lead to them. And so understanding the elements of data that drive that and knowing what impact that the different types of disruption can have on us only can be answered by looking at our data and understanding those risk points that we run into. So data and analytics become critical as we're thinking about how we can prepare ourselves to work in what was normal, what is going to be our normal now, and what we can be prepared for whatever the next disruption is. And as many of us have seen, you know, some of these that are less predictable but more frequent can happen more frequently, like the cyber attack. Cyber attacks have been on the rise throughout the year during the pandemic. All-time highs, all-time highs. So those are things we have to think about and we need to take into account as we're putting things together in our data and our modeling. So let's talk about analytics for a minute. Because as we talk about data and the things that we can use data to help us out with, we also have this opportunity to get and really understand how analytics are shaped. And we have to determine where our key opportunities are for our organization. So the Gartner group, Gartner Consulting, the analyst group, talks about analytics on this ascendancy model, where we work our way up from descriptive analytics, which is what happened, all the way up and through prescriptive analytics. So how can we make it happen? So I want you to think about this for a minute, because we do a little bit of each of these in different ways, and it becomes a little bit of the maturity that we have. Now, one of the things you'll see in their model that as we move up the ascendancy model, that the value of that analytics increases and the degree of difficulty to do it. It's like that final tumbling run at the Olympics on gymnastics. The high degree of difficulty is going to get you the higher score. So we've got a high value, but there's also a lot more to it, a lot more preparation and a lot more lift. The one thing I'm not a fan of in the ascendancy model is the fact that it looks like once we reach prescriptive analytics and we're optimizing our data and our analytics, is that we've evolved beyond descriptive. And I've taken the freedom to kind of the Bryce Gartner version of this, which is to realign it. We still have the same elements and the degree of value and difficulty still are in play, but we put our data in the center and we think about the fact that this is an ongoing process with our data. We always have descriptive information that is going to provide value in our analytics model. It's not that once we get to prescriptive, that is going to become all of a sudden the only analytics we do, because change is always happening. Change is inevitable. We're going to always continue to move along the cycle, and we're going to have to continue also to keep things evaluated from a diagnostic and redoing the predictive to drive prescriptive modeling. And so to understand that, hey, once we've reached a prescriptive answer, doesn't mean we abandon all the other types of analytics that we do. So it's really important to understand, even though you think about one of the best examples of prescriptive analytics is what we get when we log into Amazon and they prescribe what they believe based on our history is the thing that's going to interest us the most. They don't stop doing descriptive and diagnostic. They just keep adding it to the models and the conversation that's going on. So we'll take our next checkpoint poll question. This one's to see if you've been paying attention. What type of analytics provides the greatest value with the highest degree of difficulty? All right, Danny, if you can launch that poll. All right, we've got about 93% voted. I'm gonna have to emphasize point stronger is what this is telling me. All right, looks like we've got pretty much everybody in. And what I'm seeing is we've got 38% of the people who got the answer right. Prescriptive analytics are the most difficult because they have to take into account a lot of the diagnostic and predictive. to come together to be able to give a recommendation. So we had 38% of the people who got the correct answer, which was prescriptive analytics. All right, moving on. So I always like to start with, as we get into analytics, when we get into what we can take away today, is I always like to think about the 3 most common strategy mistakes we see people make around analytics. We talk about these strategies and we talk about all the great things that analytics and data can do for an organization. And too often we don't talk about, hey, where did people stub their toe? Or where did they fail to get started? So let's take these one at a time. So mistake number 1 is denial. Okay? Denial is the one we run into the most frequently. Hey, we are already doing reporting. We have all the information that we need. There's no chance that we need to add anything. Or the denial comes in the form of, we'll never be able to get at all the data that we need. We just don't have access to those systems, or the data doesn't exist. So we're going to never get started. Those are the most common mistakes we see people make, is they get in denial. What we've seen with organizations that take full advantage of this is that they get beyond denial. If they have data that they think they can't get, they start looking everywhere to figure out where they can get it. Are there outside sources? Is it just in a system? Is it in someone's head? Or they get stuck in that we already have the information. The problem is a lot of times when we have just the information available, we're not using it. And so denial is the first sign that we've got to really put some focus on taking our data strategy to the next level. 2, mistake number 2 is technology centered. Analytics, data, and business intelligence, and leveraging data inside your organization and leveraging analytics does not begin with technology. It doesn't begin in the IT department, and it doesn't end in the IT department with them telling you what the data says. The most successful organizations don't care about the technology. They know that they're going to need some to enable it, but they don't start there. You start with the business. You start with what makes a difference in the business, and then you work your way into the technology and into the data. Does this mean that IT is not important in the equation? No, but we don't want it to live on IT because it's an unfair scenario for IT. IT may have the technical prowess to extract the data that you need. They may have the technical prowess to enable you with a system that you need, but it is not IT that knows the ins and outs of the business questions that need to be answered, or the direction that you need to come at the questions. Because a lot of times direction is what makes the difference. And so as you think about the second biggest mistake, is people go out and say, well, I'm going to buy some business intelligence and data visualization and data mining software and analytics software. That is not the place to start. It's a component of what needs to happen to be successful, but we've never seen anybody be successful where they've said that's our starting point. Because when you start to identify what you want to do with the data, that drives a lot of where technology needs to go. 3, is this instant, it's going to solve all our problems and we're going to solve all of them tomorrow. We're going to eat the elephant whole, right? Too many people jump into analytics. They go to a conference, they come see a webinar, they hear great things that are being done by other organizations, and they want to go back and they want to kick this off and they want to analyze everything all by the end of next week. That is also a recipe for failure. The reason that that's a recipe for failure is because we see it time and time again, where if you try and do everything, you accomplish nothing. And so with analytics, it's no different. There needs to be a prioritization exercise. You need to think about what's going to make the biggest impact in our business, in different parts of our business, and you take the opportunity. You take the opportunity to really prioritize what happens and build a strategy that executes on the priorities, because what we see time and time again is we watch organizations prioritize a whole bunch of things, and they get through 1, 2, and 3, and they've learned information through the data and through advancing analytics through the organization that they learn in their first 5 priorities that cause some of the others to become irrelevant or much further down the priority list. And so those are the things that you have to keep in mind to avoid as you start to implement and you start to take advantage of what's there. So we'll get our third checkpoint question out of the way. What is one of the most common strategy mistakes? I have 2 of these questions that see whether you've been paying attention for the last 5 minutes. Danny, if you can launch that poll question, that would be great. Get everybody voting and hitting submit. All right, we're at 93, 94. Hopefully get this back up to 96% again. Make sure you hit submit on that so everybody gets credit. All right, let's close that out. All right, so apparently I did much better this time around in the last 5 minutes keeping your attention, because we had 74% of you get the right answer, which was denial is one of them. Denial, technology-centered, and this instant ubiquity. Those are the things to be cautious about. As we move into these next part of this conversation, I'm going to share some of the key steps that define whether you're successful or define whether you're going to struggle. I tell this to my students at Duke who are, going to a high-end, higher level institution, and they walk in the room all ready to do statistics and math and visualize data and dive into the code and do some Python coding and do some R coding and then display everything in these great visual stories. And I start off every class, and every week they have a homework assignment that is about one thing. It's about how good are you at asking critical questions around what's going to drive a business. And they look at me like I'm coming to a required class for the entire semester, and I'm gonna ask and write questions. Yeah, absolutely. Questions are the driver of all analytics. Too many times we get caught up in the math. We get caught up in what's the statistically valid outcome. Well, a statistically valid outcome is only the answer to a very important question. And so as we think about defining our critical questions, we need to think about how they support our vision. And too many times people think of vision as this amorphous phrase that's on our website under the About section that says, this is our vision. Well, our vision is our preferred future. And if we're going to be able to look back, diagnose, predict, and prescribe our direction and our progress towards our preferred future, then we have to know what questions are going to be critical to ask that provide us leading and lagging information to drive our business. We have to understand how those critical questions are going to drive our strategic objectives and how they're either going to prove a theory that we've had in what I call organizational mythology, which every organization has. An organization that I was a part of had an organizational mythology about its members. And we, coming into that organization void of data, although we saw our members a lot, void of data, that organization had a picture of what the profile of a member looked like. We had 5 key demographic areas that we believed defined our membership. I call that mythology because that's what we believed. And we wrote it down because we wrote down our beliefs. But when we asked critical questions, one of the critical questions was, hey, let's prove or disprove this myth. And when we wrote down those questions and we proved or disproved that myth, we disproved it in a big way. We had 5 key demographic things and we were wrong about 4 of them. 75-year-old organization, wrong about 4 of them. It's really important to understand that a lot of times in an organization, we think, but we don't know. We think because it's what we observe, or we observe things that are visual in a setting that may not be true when we really dive into it. And so we need to define those critical questions to get us where we want to go. So an example of this in defining critical questions, a large university we work with wanted to define the life cycle of a student. They wanted to ask critical questions about recruiting, enrollment, graduation, and alumni. They wanted to look at each of those elements of data so they could improve on those because it drove their future. They wanted to recruit stronger students. They wanted those students to have an incredible experience while they were enrolled in the school. They wanted them to graduate in the time allotted. They wanted them to graduate at high rates, and then they wanted their alumni experience to be solid. So they built questions around to evaluate each of those areas, and then they pulled those together into a fantastic story that shared the process and the life cycle of what a student would look like throughout that entire process. And it had a huge impact on how they recruited and how they enrolled, how they evaluated classes, how they understood what the off-ramp looked like at graduation and into the workforce, and how they could keep those people engaged as alumni. By asking critical questions about what they were looking for their preferred future in all of these areas, they came up with a list of questions that they could gather the data and answer, and then make it available to people to improve their process and to prescribe outcomes. The next area besides critical questions is, as we ask these critical questions, what we start to see are data elements. What do we need from our data to enrich our analysis? We a lot of times only think about internal data. We think about the data we have in our financial systems or our ERP system, maybe some operational data that we have available to us, and some marketing data. Oftentimes, we don't even ask questions about what we could get from outside that might give us an even bigger impact to those critical questions that could add some additional components, add to our recipe of analytics that gives us deeper insights, more flavor, gives us more insight to what we're trying to accomplish. There is so much external data, both free and readily available, and that data that is also paid for, that we can go buy, that a lot of times is not that expensive, that once we add it to the analysis that we're trying to do, it can be a simple report. It can be basic, the most basic of statistics, but when you add in a little bit of information to that analysis, it makes that so much more rich. The example here is a foundation and an event center. They really wanted to accelerate their growth. They wanted to see fundraising activities improve. They knew that by also increasing the number of people that they got to their destination, that they would improve their ability to grow donations, fund their mission, and reach their preferred future. So they looked at their internal data. They looked a lot at donors and visitors. They looked at programs. They looked at the programs that they offered and how people participated, whether they were educational programs or they were special events. They also looked at things that they had as historical event trends. So they looked at all the information, and that helped. But as they looked at some of their critical questions, they wanted to understand some outside factors that they didn't have information on. They wanted a deeper understanding of what was happening in similar philanthropic organizations. They wanted to understand from an event and a attendance standpoint, what impact did the weather have on it? What other events going on in the area had positive and negative impacts on their events? If they coordinated around other events, did that have a positive impact on what happened in their attendance trends? If they were looking at the community calendar of what else was going on in the city, what events had an impact, what events didn't have an impact? Where did those overlap with the people that they were trying to attract and attend? All of that information was available for free. They just had to identify the critical questions that they believed would have an impact on their preferred future, and then identify the additional data elements that could play into what they were hoping to accomplish. So as we think about the steps we go through, when we think about the critical questions and we think about the data elements, now we can really start to think about how we apply analytics and what approach and what part of the ascendancy model do we work our way through, and how do we take from descriptive to diagnostic to predictive to prescriptive when we have critical questions and we have the data identified. We can collect it, we can build a strategy around it, and then we can start to apply it in all of those different levels. And as we do that, a lot of times organizations are, we're seeing the IBM commercials, we're seeing everything that's there, and we're thinking about AI and ML. We're thinking about how do we use artificial intelligence and machine learning? And some people think that is so far past where we are. We don't even have a data strategy yet. Well, you may not get to AI and machine learning today or tomorrow. You might get there 3 years from now. But it's going to become easier and easier to get there. And what you need to be thinking about now is those critical questions, the data that's important to answer some of those critical questions today, and then how that's going to position you well when it's time to start to introduce some of this modeling. Get deeper into the modeling and understand how you design models to incorporate more data. As I showed you that chart of all of the attendees for today, a lot of you are on the East Coast or along the East Coast. The most common use of AI and ML that everybody sees today is during hurricane season, right? We see the spaghetti models on where all of those are going to go. Well, the critical question is really simple that we're trying to answer in applying analytics there is, Where is it going to make landfall and what is its track going to be, right? And we have the spaghetti models that show it going all over the place, but they've gotten more and more condensed and more specific because they've learned to ask the ancillary critical questions of what's impacting it and put it into models. And those models allow us to narrow that spread and prescribe solutions and getting to a higher degree of accuracy. Well, that didn't happen overnight. That happened by determining what data was most important to collect and then evolving slowly to where we get to where we are today, where they're predicting at a high degree of certainty exactly what's going to happen. And so we need to think about that in the same way. And so I'm going to talk about a healthcare professional association that took that approach. They had identified the critical questions about 4 or 5 years ago. They had started implementing the basics of analytics over the last 3 or 4 years. And then they realized, hey, we want to get further faster. And so as we think about that, and as we think about where we're going, we want to think about how AI and ML can help get us there. And so they wanted to build models of how members engage, not what they speculated by where they were in their career or where they were geographically, but they wanted to see exactly how different members engaged and worked their way back into, so they could kind of predict a lifetime engagement model for different types of members in their organization, and had a tremendous impact on how the organization approached membership engagement. So we're going to hit our next checkpoint poll question, and then we're going to roll through finishing up. As you work with data and analytics, does your organization currently share data, or do they share data stories? Get some quick answers on this. We're rolling through this pretty quickly. Got 92% of the people voting. Remember to hit submit on your vote so you get credit. All right, let's go ahead and close out that poll. So we had 60% of the people say they share data. That's what most people do. You saw it in that first slide. Only about 16% of people are really using, have companies have their organization really using data. I like the 12% that have no idea what a data story is, because a lot of people don't. And very few, I'm impressed that we have 30% of the people who use data stories. Data stories are really important because the final step, no matter how much AI and machine learning we use, no matter how good we do with the data, no matter how good we do with asking critical questions, when all is said and done, it comes down to how well do we communicate it? Our CFO at Isimo, prior to being acquired, had been a CFO for a long time at a large organization. And he came to me and he said, one day after being with us for about 2 years, and he said, Bryce, I finally get it. He said, I have, and this is after he went back and we had brought on his former organization as a client. He went back and they were still using an Excel report that was one he created 9 years before. And he said, I finally get it. He said, I went back and I looked at that report that I created, and the fact that they were still using it and people sitting around a meeting that had all been given the report were looking at it like they didn't know what was in it. Well, because it was a bunch of numbers, and a lot of people don't react well to a spreadsheet of a bunch of numbers. And so we have to, because that's what made sense to him in what he wanted to communicate. He wasn't thinking about his audience. He wasn't thinking about analytics and data being a communications function. And it's a communications function because we have to engage audiences. We have to provide insight that makes sense to them, and we have to tell the story to demystify all the complicated stuff that we're doing in the math of analytics or the machine learning and the artificial intelligence. I guarantee you, if you logged into Amazon today and they showed you the scores of all of the products that they put up on that are resulting in what you see in the 3 recommended product next to you, and they just put the name, if they put the name and the score that it achieved based on your history, and then all the math that got them there, you wouldn't be inclined to buy that product. But that's what we ask our organization to do on an ongoing basis. We ask them to look at a bunch of numbers that doesn't really mean anything to them and ask them to make decisions on it. We have to think about how we engage audiences and how we demystify what's going on. So a quick university story is about how we can work our way through understanding very quickly and engaging in exactly what's happening. We can see over time what's happening with race and ethnicity, and we can get a really quick answer on what's happening. We can look at what's happening with our FTEs in each of our different colleges, drilled in on a single college, understanding how those have evolved over time. We can look at how our graduation rates are being impacted by each of our colleges across the country. We could drill into that by year or gender or major and see how all of this is playing out. We can dive deeper into some of our cohorts in the state of North Carolina. We can look at the different demographics and breakdowns of what's going on, looking at aid, admissions, the demographics, the campus safety, athletics. We can drill deeper into safety. We can dig deeper into graduation rates and ethnicity. We can dig deeper into financial aid. Telling a story that lets us look at a high level and work our way through even into athletics. We tell a data story that gives us insight into what's happening in our organization. We can do the same thing at the association level. We can think at an executive level of what's happening with revenue, what's happening with education, what's happening with our members and our new members. What does our trend look like? Where do we have high densities of members? Where does that fall? What's the breakdown of our membership? Has a big impact on where we are. What is our risk level of members that are renewing, that we're trying to pull in? Where do they fall? What's happening with individual meetings? As we look and drill into a meeting that's happening in Kansas City, where is everyone coming from? How big of a draw is that meeting? You know, with COVID, we've seen a lot of the meetings go online. So we're not pulling people in, but when we start to turn these things back on, what are the destinations that are our best draws, our best attendance? What's the relationship between locations and content? What are the things that are driving our revenue? We can tell the data story in less than 3 minutes. When we think about what the audience is looking to see, and when we can think about who is receiving it, and we think about it in a visual way and not just in the way that we're used to, which is pushing out numbers. How can we help people do those things? The things I want you to take away most as we wrap up today from this is hopefully you'll understand and avoid the mistakes that I outlined and talked about. But the things that you need to walk away with most are how these things build on one another. How we take critical questions to define and identify what's going to have the biggest impact, what is going to be the most important to our organization that we answer. What data can I gather internally, and what might I need to look at externally to make better decisions? How can I start thinking about today whether I'm wanting to apply artificial intelligence and machine learning today, or whether it's something I'm going to want to do in the future? How can I prep myself to be ready to take full advantage of that? And then the most important thing, whether you go get external data elements, whether you get into AI and ML, even if you're working at the most basic, at the bottom tier of the hierarchy of just describing what's going on in descriptive analytics, the way that we communicate, the way that we share information has got to be audience focused. It's got to be thinking about the receiver and not the deliverer of that information. Hopefully you've gotten at least one nugget out of what I've shared today. I really appreciate all of you taking the time, and I hope you have a great rest of your year and holiday season. Thank you, Matthew, for the opportunity. And I know you're coming back in to do some wrap-up comments before everyone moves into their next session. Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions. Our digital team is happy to help.
Thank you so much, Bryce. We really appreciate you and your insights, and I'm constantly impressed by everything that your group does. This session is a wrap. Remember that you're going to have to log out of this GoToMeeting and go back to the agenda and click on the unique link for the next session, which will be starting up in just about 10 minutes. So we will see you all there. Thank you.